The Chinese Tub by Edgar P. Meynell, author of Marked for Death, Detective Story Magazine, June 1930. Out of a peaceful existence, she was lifted into dangerous adventure. Chapter 1. Blackmail. As Helen Riddel opened the door of her roadster that bright September afternoon, something indefinite, something which she was never afterward able to explain or understand, drew her head around. The car was standing at the curb outside Messenger's department store. At this time of the day, 3 o'clock, the wide, concrete walk was crowded with shoppers. Helen saw the solid stream of faces, saw the gay autumn frocks of the girls and women, which made them look like brightly colored flowers in an old-fashioned garden. And then she saw Theo Bursley. She hadn't seen him for years, and he had changed decidedly, she realized even in that first glance, and not for the better. His face was deeply tanned. His eyes, which for a moment held hers, were narrowed and calculating. Altogether there was something predatory and dangerous in the face of this man whom she had once thought she loved. A shudder ran through her flesh. She slid quickly into the car, and the next moment was swinging hurriedly out from the curb. She had completed her shopping, and now she drove home and into the two-car garage adjoining the house. 5 minutes later she was in her room, her purchases thrown on the daybed, her wide, excited eyes studying the face that looked out at her from her mirror. That face had changed too, she realized, in the days since that early love affair. She had been a girl then, and now she was a woman. Mere girlish prettiness had changed to something fuller, richer, deeper. A look had come into her eyes, the expression of serene expectancy which comes to a woman who loves and is deeply loved in return. She had been happy every day of her married life. Not that there weren't little things, such as Jim's unreasoning jealousy and his preoccupation with business, but she looked upon these details as really evidence of his love for her. She was the only woman in the world for him, as he often told her, and he didn't want other men looking at her with that hungry expression he always read into their glances. That made him jealous, and he wanted her to have everything she had ever dreamed of having, and that made him industrious. She had been very happy. She had come a long way since she and Theo used to hold hands. A vivid flush, almost of shame, swept over her face as she thought of her agony when he had gone away to a distant city. She could feel again the hot tears that had flowed down over her cheeks. A tap at the door brought her slowly around. She had been so immersed in those old memories that for an instant she was unable to place herself. Beatrice, one of the maids, opened the door in response to her low-spoken command. "A man to see you, Mrs. Riddel." The girl's keen, inquisitive eyes were fastened on her face. Helen knew that she must look startled, almost frightened. "A man? Did he give you his name?" "He didn't give his name, but he said you would be expecting him." Helen turned back toward her dressing table. Yes, she had been expecting him, although she had tried to hide the truth from herself. She knew who the caller was, without asking additional questions. "Tell him I will be down in a few minutes," she said without turning her head. By the time she went down the wide staircase that led into the reception hall, she had partially mastered her excitement. Her heart was still beating fast and hard, but she felt that her eyes were steady and that her manner would not betray her. She entered the East Room, into which visitors were always shown, and stood for a moment, silently appraising the dark, lean face turned upon her own. Yes, he had changed, terribly. Instinctively, she seemed to glimpse the formidable adventures he had passed through, which had brought him to this. "You have a good memory for faces, my dear," Theo Bursley said in a low, purring voice. "I've changed, and you could hardly have been expecting me, but you knew me in an instant. Why did you run away?" Helen felt her hard-won self-control slipping away from her. Her lips parted. One hand came slowly up toward her throat. Then she turned toward the French windows which opened into the garden. "Come out here if you must talk to me," she said. She hardly recognized her own voice. It was thick and unsteady. He followed her without comment. When they had gone down the steps into the garden, he strode along at her side. They reached a summer house, and Helen mutely gestured for him to enter and seat himself. "Now what is it you want?" she demanded, standing before him. "Want? My dear Helen, don't dare call me that. I am Mrs. Riddel." "Ah, yes, so I have learned. But why all the heroics?" Why, indeed. Again, she fought valiantly with her fear. She was playing her hand very badly. After a moment, she sat down, some distance from where he was sitting. "Forgive me," she murmured. "You certainly startled me. I thought you were dead." "It was necessary for you to think that. I was dead to you. I had to disappear, and I did it very completely. As a matter of fact, I am a dead man now. Theo Bursley died and was buried. I am only his ghost." She was reacting from her excitement. She forced herself to relax, to sit quietly back, listening to his low, purring voice. Even that had changed. "Yes," she said. "Of course I don't understand." "Of course you don't. It's hardly necessary. I got into trouble, terrible trouble. Never mind just what it was. Even a ghost can feel fear. I had to make my exit from the drama and leave you and the others to their own devices. Of course, I knew you wouldn't break your heart over me, in spite of those letters you wrote. Pretty hot letters, Mrs. Riddel. I still have them." She had known that too. Those letters, written with all the heat and ardor of her puppy love, innocent letters, but so foolish, so easily misunderstood. "You have them?" she murmured. "Yes, dear lady, I have them, and they are for sale." Everything that had lain hidden in her deeper mind was now openly expressed. She had known, in that moment, when she looked into the hungry, threatening eyes of this man out of the past, that he would follow her home, that he had those schoolgirl love letters of hers, and that he would threaten her with them. A voice sounded from the direction of the house. "Helen! Oh, Helen!" Helen Riddel was on her feet, standing in the doorway of the summer house, speaking tensely over her shoulder. "Stay here. I'll come back when I can." She flew along the gravelled path and up the steps. Jim stood in one of the open French windows, looking smilingly down. "Enjoying the roses?" he inquired. "You might have brought poor old hubby one." "I was in too much of a hurry when I heard you calling," Helen told him, and blushed hotly at the ironic truth of her statement. Jim was looking strangely at her. She didn't imagine it. There was a spark of suspicion or of uneasiness in his eyes. He slipped an arm round her and led her back into the east room. "Dinner nearly ready?" he asked, and now she was sure he was trying to make his voice sound casual. "Come on, we'll see." She wasn't taking any chances on leaving him alone. He might saunter out into the garden, and her heart gave a great smothered throb when she thought of what might happen if he found Theo Bursley sitting in the summer house. It wasn't only that Jim's jealousy would suddenly be quickened into flaming life. He might be in danger, physical danger, from the terrible creature lurking there. Dinner was ready. They sat down in the pleasant dining room, and Jim talked casually of the events of his day. Helen always tried to show her interest in these things. Tonight it was not difficult. She was immensely interested in every word her husband uttered, in every glance he gave her. The impression grew upon her that he was uneasy, was watching her, and then suddenly he spoke. "There's no use hiding my guilty secret any longer, old dear, or trying to hide it. You've been watching me like a hawk ever since I came home. You knew, you little rascal. I've got a committee meeting on for tonight. There. I don't know whether we have anything on or not. The Grenagers were coming over to play bridge. Deuce take it, I knew there was something. Well, you call them up and—" "I'll do nothing of the kind. You go to the phone this minute and talk with Mr. Grenager. There's absolutely no reason why I should always have to break dates." Jim meekly rose and laid his napkin aside. "Want them to come over and keep you company?" he asked, looking ridiculously timid and apologetic. "Of course not. Imagine proposing three-handed bridge to two fanatics like the Grenagers, and bridge is all they ever talk about. Just get yourself out the best way you can." Something deep within her listened and criticized. What a hypocrite she was. She was saving herself and making poor old Jim think he was to blame for everything. But issues were involved tonight that would brook no argument. She must save herself and him. Jim Riddel came back, perspiring and red-faced. "Whew," he muttered. "That wasn't so hot. You'd think bridge was the be-all and the end-all of existence. Greniger was quite stiff with me. Well, it can't be helped, and I'm more bothered about you than about the neighbors. You'll have a dull evening, dear. I'll manage. I've plenty of reading in the house, don't worry." Jim left as soon as he had finished dinner. Having cleared up his various difficulties, he set out for his committee meeting with all the enthusiasm of a small boy going to a performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Helen waited 5 minutes, then returned to the summer house. Bursley was waiting with an ominous kind of patience. "Get hubby out of the way," he said softly, but there was a sneer in the words, for all their velvet quality. "Well, I've waited plenty long enough. I told you that I wanted to sell those letters of yours. You're the logical buyer." Helen was steadier than she had been before dinner. She stood looking down at the crouching figure. He was like a great spider, huddled there in the shadow of the rose branches. "To think that I once fancied I loved you," she murmured. "You call yourself a man, and you try to sell me the letters I wrote you. Life has kicked me hard, and I've learned to kick back. My price is $1,000 cash." $1,000? Where would I get that much money? That's your concern. Beg, borrow, or steal it if you haven't it on hand. The point is, you can get the money, and it will be the best investment you can make. You weren't anxious to have friend husband find me here. Suppose he learns that I waited while you got rid of him, and then reads these red-hot letters of yours. I haven't the money. Don't tell me that again. I never was patient, as you ought to remember. Get the money, any way you see it, and bring it to me at this address. Bring it in person, and don't you dare try any tricks." He stood up and approached her. She shrank back. For a moment his hands were on her arms, the fingers gripping down till she wanted to scream. Then he had pushed her roughly aside and was gliding along the garden path. In her quivering fingers was a scrap of paper, which Theo Bursley had put there. Chapter 2. Donovan Makes a Promise. There was an address on the scrap of paper Helen Riddel saw, after she had hurried to her room and locked herself in with her problem. Her fear-widened eyes took in the words and numbers scrawled in pencil, but she had never heard the name of the street. It must be in some remote part of the city. What ought she to do? Her eyes came slowly up, and she saw her own face reflected in a mirror across the room. If Jim were to have come upon her at this moment, nothing she could have said would have explained the look of stark horror he would have seen. When she heard him calling her from the steps leading into the garden earlier in the evening, she ought to have turned Bursley over to her husband's care. That was the natural and common-sense solution, but she had instinctively avoided it then, and now she had come a long way from anything so simple and easy. Every second's delay after that logical moment had added tremendously to her difficulties. Now she was out of sight of land, floating on a chip, with the high seas breaking all about her. Dim memories of the things she had written back in those schoolgirl days came back to her, and in an instant her cheeks were burning. Jim would never have understood. If he could really have seen everything as it was, could have put aside his ridiculous jealousy, he would not want her to expose her heart. He wouldn't ask it. But on the other hand, it would be infinitely worse to let Theo Bursley go to Jim with the letters. That wasn't to be thought of. $1,000? Helen thought of her diamonds. She had quite a collection of them. Women in trouble and in need of money pawned their jewels. But Helen hadn't the faintest idea how that was done. Should she ask Jim for the money? To ask such a question was to answer it. He wouldn't begrudge her the money, but, of course, he would want to know what she intended doing with it. She quickly came to the conclusion that there was no way in the world for her to raise $1,000 in cash for any such purpose as she now had before her. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed. And suddenly, there flashed upon the curtain of her inner consciousness a face, a rugged, honest face, which she had not seen for many months. Clyde Donovan, a college friend of her dead brother's, had been almost as much at home in Helen's home for several years as he had at his own boarding house. Clyde apparently had no family of his own. When Ed died, Helen had tearfully promised herself to look after the young fellow who had almost broken down at the grave. But after that had come her marriage, and she had forgotten. Now hastily she stood up. She hurried across to a closet and slipped into an evening cloak. For a moment, after she had unlocked the hall door, she hesitated. Should she call Clyde and be sure he was at home? But Beatrice and the other servants would be sure to hear her talking, and observation was one thing she must avoid, so she went quickly down to the front door and let herself out. The evening was fine, but that meant little to the young woman hurrying along the deserted street. She had not even dared take her car, for it might be noticed and Jim might hear of it. Her heart throbbed rebelliously when she realized how involved she was in this web of lies and evasions. Once she paused abruptly, a slow flush rising to her cheeks. She ought to go back, wait till her husband returned, and tell him the truth. There was nothing in it for her to fear, only the eager sentimentalism of a young girl. But Jim was the last man on earth to understand, and she didn't dare risk it. So she went on, and half an hour later, she was ringing the bell of Clyde Donovan's apartment. He was waiting for her in his open door when she stepped from the elevator. His face was gaunter than she remembered it. She looked pleadingly into the steady hazel eyes. A lock of coarse, straight black hair hung across his forehead. He swung his head with a gesture she remembered, as well as if she had seen it yesterday. Then he ran his fingers through that black mane of his and stood aside for her to enter. Clyde Donovan had done well in business, partly perhaps because he was not a very companionable young fellow, and was left much to himself. He had to work hard to keep from being bored. He had few distractions. His apartment was well furnished, but it showed at the first glance that it was strictly a bachelor establishment. Helen looked quickly round, then again was facing her dead brother's friend. "You didn't expect to see me," she murmured, and could have bitten her tongue out at the inane remark. "I've been meaning to call for a long time," she added, and realized she had not made things any better. "I've seen your name in the paper once in a while," Clyde said. "I read the society columns just to kind of keep track of you." He was smiling, that faithful till death smile she remembered so well. In an instant all the hesitancy was gone from her heart. Here was a man with whom she didn't have to be diplomatic. He expected nothing for himself, was ready to give without promise of return. "Clyde," she whispered, "I'm in terrible trouble. I can't tell Jim about it, so I've come to you. Please sit down and listen." He seated himself obediently. There was a little tightening of the strong mouth, a furrow of attention on the broad forehead. "Tell me about it, Helen," he said. Helen told him of seeing Bursley on the street, and of his coming to the house. "I never really cared for him," she explained, repeating the old phrase women from the time of Eve's daughters up have used about their discarded lovers. "I was a silly young thing, and the time had come when I had to love something, so I created a man and called him Theo Bursley. I never saw him as he was, although I'm sure he wasn't then anything like what he is now. He is terrible. I can't make you understand how terrible he is." Clyde Donovan smiled faintly at her energy. "I've known a few bad eggs," he remarked. "Now let's get this straight. You wrote him some love letters and he threatens to take them to Mr. Riddel unless you pay him $1,000? "Yes, and they would ruin my life if Jim were to see them. You know, Clyde, they were just the sentimental ravings of a silly child. I actually wrote poetry to him. I called him my sun-crowned hero. Imagine poor old Jim reading that. He'd never feel the same toward me again." Her companion nodded soberly. "I guess he wouldn't," he agreed. "Anyhow, that isn't the point. You want the letters back, or want them destroyed. And you want this dog shut up. Well, I could buy him off, and if I thought he'd disappear and never come back, I'd do it. But he wouldn't. I've read the newspapers, and I know this blackmail game. There's only one way to handle a fellow like this, but never mind the details. I'll get your letters back for you, Helen, and I'll see to it this skunk flies his kite." Helen had always winced at Clyde Donovan's salty expressions in the old days, but now she found them singularly comforting. She closed her eyes for a moment, then quickly stood up and held out her hand. "I'm not going to try to thank you, Clyde," she said. "I knew I could count on you. You were the first and the only person in the world I thought of appealing to. I'm glad of that. And just you lay the thing off your mind. It's as good as settled." She gave him the slip of paper containing Theo Bursley's address. Clyde read and nodded. "He's roosting in the Oriental Quarter," he commented. "Well, I'll go down and see him, and you can call me sometime tomorrow. Before 9 I'll be here, and afterward I'll be at the office. Good night, and don't you dare to worry." She had a final glimpse of his rugged face and of his broad shoulders as he stood in the open doorway of his apartment, waiting for her to enter the elevator. Chapter 3. A Visit from the Police. Beatrice was hovering near the front door when Helen Riddel arrived home. The maid's inquisitive eyes locked steadily with her mistress's. "Mr. Riddel called a few minutes ago," she said. "I told him you were taking a bath, and he said not to worry if he didn't get home before midnight." Helen frowned, hesitated, then turned toward the stairway. She began to realize how unfit she was for a life involving anything other than honesty. This girl was not to be trusted, but she was already deeply involved in the affair concerning Theo Bursley. She had admitted him and had probably seen Helen take him out to the summer house. Now she had taken it upon herself to lie to Jim, and Helen didn't dare reprimand her for her presumption. "I hope I did right, Mrs. Riddel," Beatrice said. "If you thought I was bathing, it was all right to tell Mr. Riddel so," the mistress of the house replied without turning her head. She went up to her room, and by the time Jim came tiptoeing up the stairs, she was apparently asleep. But long after his steady breathing told her that he had forgotten the cares and vicissitudes of money-making for the rest of the night, she lay staring at the dimly visible ceiling. She had left Clyde Donovan with a feeling of perfect confidence. For a moment, she vainly fancied that the heavy weight of her problem had been transferred to other, stronger shoulders. Clyde was capable and direct. He seemed to know just what he was going to do. But by the time she lay down to rest, a reaction had set in. After all, what could Clyde do? He had said he wouldn't pay the extortioner anymore, and without paying, how could he hope to get the letters? What had she expected him to do? She must have been temporarily out of her mind. No good could come from the meeting of these two, and very easily, evil might come. Clyde was so confident, but he didn't know the evil creature he was up against. Her brief encounters with Theo Bursley had developed in Helen Riddle's mind a surprising belief in the evil possibilities of her girlhood lover. Perhaps her subconscious had noticed things about him then that it wouldn't admit, but had stored away for future use. His selfishness, his quick temper, his ready resort to violence. At any rate, she was now certain without argument that Bursley was capable of murder. That word came like a wraith into her thoughts. She sat up in bed, her hands groping for the covers. She must call Clyde at once and assure herself that he had gotten safely back to his apartment. But of course, she couldn't do that. The web was wrapping itself around her. Soon, she would be unable to turn or move. Her lips parted. She sat staring into the soft darkness. A sensation of terror wrapped itself around her. She felt that something unspeakably evil had drifted into the room, something ghostly and terrible. For a space of minutes, she could hardly keep herself from screaming. After that, her pounding heart steadied, and she sank back into her pillow, lying through the long hours of darkness. listening to the regularly recurring chimes of the French clock in the lower hall, trying in vain to sleep. As dawn began to drift into the room, she sighed deeply and turned her head. She opened her eyes and stared before her. Sunshine lay like gold leaf on the floor and on the coverlet. It must be late. Jim was gone. He had dressed without her hearing him. Her head was heavy, but she slid quickly out of bed. It was 8:45. Helen slipped into a dressing gown and went into the hall. Beatrice was dusting. "I'll take breakfast in my room," Helen said. "Melon, toast and coffee." After the maid's footsteps had died out in the distance, she seated herself at the telephone table and looked up Clyde Donovan's residence number. She put through the call and sat waiting. The phone hummed, and occasionally the chatter of voices broke into her anxious reverie. But at last, the prim voice of Central told her that her party did not answer. Helen felt suddenly cold and frightened. He had said he would be at his apartment till 9, and he wasn't the kind to deviate from even such an indirect promise. She waited 5 minutes. Beatrice brought up her breakfast tray and was sent back to the kitchen for hot water. Helen tried again. "They do not answer," Central informed her after another wait. Helen made a pretense of eating breakfast, but now she was thoroughly alarmed, and even the thought of food was repugnant. Finally, she rang for Beatrice and had the tray taken away. Standing in the doorway of her room, Helen waited until she heard a door slam in the direction of the kitchen. Again, she hurried across to the phone table. She tried to get Clyde's apartment, then hunted up his office number. A woman's voice promptly answered. "Mr. Donovan hasn't come in yet," she said. "Will you leave a message? What time does he usually come to the office in the morning? He should be here now, if you'll leave your number." "I'll call later," Helen said, and hung up. She went into her room and crossed to a window. Looking through it, she could see the rose garden, the gravelled paths, and the summer house where she had met with Bursley. Her flesh was hot and cold alternately. She tried to think, but the human mind is easily thrown off balance by a high voltage of emotion. Now all she could see were quickly shifting images, as if she were looking into a kaleidoscope. She saw Jim, his face red with amazement and anger. She saw Clyde Donovan lying with his eyes half closed, the colour gone from his rugged cheeks. She saw herself, stared at, whispered about, deserted. At 10, she called Donovan's office a second time. He had not yet come in, the telephone girl said. Helen waited until noon and called again. He had not come in. She called only once during the afternoon. Something occurred on that occasion that frightened her away from the telephone. In answer to her question, the woman's voice at the other end of the line stated that Mr. Donovan had not been at the office that day. "You're the lady who's been calling, aren't you?" The phone girl continued. "Would you mind giving me your name and address? We are quite worried about Mr. Donovan." Helen hung up abruptly. In a flash, she saw it all. Clyde had confronted Theo Bursley and demanded the letters. There had been a fight, and the man she had so recklessly dragged into this sordid affair had been killed. Now, despite everything, she would be involved in the case. They were sure to connect her with it sooner or later. But she couldn't wait for that, she realized. The time had come at last when she must confront the thing that menaced her without trying to dodge or twist. If Clyde had been murdered, as she was certain he had, she would not be able to wait until they dragged her out. She must go to the police and tell her story. However, the time had not quite come for that. She sent out for afternoon papers and read them through, looking for any tiny fragment of news that might have a bearing on the tragedy. There was nothing. Evening came, and the evening home edition. Again, there was nothing. She had feared headlines announcing the discovery of the murder. She found herself pacing the floor and abruptly sat down. Jim came in soon after 6 and, without preamble, announced that he had another board meeting. "Got to get this thing settled," he said grimly. "The only time all of us can get together is at night." He went on explaining, but his wife hardly heard a word of what he said. She was listening for something, a sharp step outside the front door, the ringing of the bell. She had the feeling that time was closing in about her, and that it would be minutes, at the outside, before the earth opened to swallow her. But Jim had dressed and gone out for the evening before the expected ring came. Helen Riddel stood up. She heard one of the maids hurrying to the door, then caught the murmur of voices. Footsteps sounded, coming swiftly toward the east room. The door, which was ajar, swung fully open, and she saw, standing for an instant on the threshold and looking steadily in at her, a tall, strongly built man of 50 or thereabouts. He wore gold-rimmed glasses and was dressed so that he might have been a doctor, a lawyer, or a banker. But she knew that he was a detective. He advanced a couple of steps, looked back into the hall and spoke. "We won't need you, my girl. Just you go to your room and read your book." Helen heard the girl hurry away. The door closed, and again the stranger was looking down at her. "Mrs. Riddel?" he inquired. "I'm Inspector Forbes of the homicide detail." In spite of herself, a tortured cry escaped her lips. "Have they found him? Is he dead?" "You're the party that called Walnut 3242 several times today?" Inspector Forbes continued, without heeding her questions. "I had the call traced the last time. By then, I had got around to Donovan's office." Helen's thoughts began to clear. She sat looking up at the detective, trying to read his expression. It was at the same time benignant and severe. "Now, Mrs. Riddel," the inspector said, "I think it would be best for you to just run over your story with me, without wasting any more time. You ask if he has been found and if he is dead. My reply to both questions is yes. Now, as the serial writers say, let's go on from there, although, as a matter of fact, we've really got to go back to the first chapters." Helen sat drooping in her chair. She had known it all the time, but this was a different kind of knowing. "I sent him to his death," she said, her voice so low that instinctively the detective stooped toward her. "I can't understand now how I could have been so selfish or so blind. I was in trouble, I can't tell you about that, but I went to Clyde and he volunteered to help me. He had to confront this creature. When I couldn't get him at his apartment early this morning, I feared the worst. I don't know what to do." Inspector Forbes listened, his head on one side. "I'm going to ask you to come with me," he commented. "No, of course, you're not under arrest. There's no reason why you should be, is there? You didn't kill him." "Oh, no. But must I come? How long will it take?" "I'll have you back in half an hour. I'll get my cloak." Helen hurried up the stairs. 3 minutes later, she was seated in Inspector Forbes's car and was being whirled through the streets. They penetrated a part of town she had never seen before, and after that came to a stop in front of a 4-story brick building. On the ground floor was a Chinese grocery. "Up here. And don't you be afraid of anything," Forbes said. "Just keep hold of my arm." They went up 2 flights. A policeman outside a closed door saluted. "All quiet, Inspector," he announced. Inspector Forbes nodded and opened the door. He stood aside for his companion to pass. Helen took a step forward. A drop light in the center of the room was turned on, and directly beneath it was something. She cried out in amazement. The sightless eyes leered at her, the crooked mouth seemed to grin. Dead, unmistakably dead, but it was the predatory face of Theo Bursley that stared, mask-like, up at her. Chapter 4. Helen explains. Through the confusion and horror that followed her discovery, 2 distinct thoughts penetrated Helen Riddle's mind. The first was that if Theo Bursley was dead, Clyde was probably alive. That brought her a great feeling of relief. The belief that he had been killed while trying to help her had been so terrible that her own little problem was, for the time, forgotten. But Clyde hadn't been killed. She didn't try to work out the logic of this conclusion. She was sure now that he was alive. She drew in a deep breath as she entered the room, gently but remorselessly propelled by the hand of the detective, which rested for a moment on her arm. But the second thought was of a different character. It brought a quick flush of resentment into her cheeks as she faced Inspector Forbes. He had tricked her into telling of Clyde's visit here. She saw now that Forbes' statement that he had been found and that he was dead had referred to Bursley. He had let her assume whatever came most easily into her consciousness, and she had made damaging admissions in her ignorance. The man from headquarters seemed to be reading her thoughts without effort. "My business, young lady," he said, "is to catch the man who did this murder. The fact that he may be a friend of yours has nothing to do with it. Did you ever see this before?" This was a little brightly lacquered box with 2 gay figures painted on it. It was about 3.5 inches square by 1/2 an inch deep. Helen looked irritably at it. "No, I never saw it before," she replied. "And I certainly wouldn't think of telling you if I had," she added with spirit. Inspector Forbes shook his leonine head. "That's not the way to talk or to feel," said he. "But in this case, it doesn't happen to make any difference. Your friend owned this cigarette case, which fortunately is an unusual one. During the fight last night it fell out of his pocket. It took some of my men all the morning to find the dealer who sold it, but our troubles were at an end when we found him. He knew Mr. Donovan personally and gave us his name and business address. It isn't often we get a break like that at the beginning of a case." Helen had a new perception of the complexity of life. She saw it as a vast mechanism, where one cogwheel is meshed to another, and where a series of apparently casual relationships can be traced, by the adept at such things, over a wide span. A wooden cigarette case, made in France, imported to America, and sold by a neighborhood tobacconist, had brought Clyde Donovan into the shadow of the gallows. "How was this creature killed?" she asked, her voice husky. "Well, first he was beaten up very thoroughly, and then he was stabbed. A clever job. Under the arm, so that we didn't find the stab wound till the medical examiner came around and pointed it out to us." Helen ignored the expression of disgust that, for the moment, appeared on her companion's face at the mention of the medical examiner. One word stood out before her, as if it had been written in letters of fire. "Stabbed?" she cried. "Clyde never did that. Never." "You think not?" "I know he didn't. I would believe it of myself sooner than of him. Indies are very handy with knives and with pistols too," Inspector Forbes commented. "Give a nice, quiet-mannered young woman who has never seen a gat sufficient provocation, and let her get her hand on a gun, and she'll make a bullseye of the villain's heart as sure as anything. But that doesn't prove your boyfriend didn't stab our party here. You see, the cards lie kind of funny. You tell me that he came here to face this egg for your sake. Murder has been done many and many a time for the sake of nowhere near as pretty a face as yours, my dear. So we know he came, and we've pretty good evidence that he gave the deceased a terrible beating. Then he stabbed him. Of course he did. Otherwise, why did he take himself off?" "Where did he go?" Helen asked unsteadily. Forbes smiled. "Yes, that's it. Where did he go? And why, if he wasn't guilty?" "Are you sure he wasn't killed? Have you looked for his body?" "Who would have killed him? Theo Bursley, of course. He had it in his heart to commit murder." "So his name was Theo Bursley. That isn't what he was called hereabouts. But to get back to your little conundrum, if Bursley here had killed him, his body would be lying in this room or not too far from here, wouldn't it?" "Well, it isn't. The neighborhood has been gone over with a fine tooth comb." Helen could see that he was telling the truth. Indeed, that idea of Clyde's also having been killed in the battle of the previous night had not been a very convincing one. She stood now, looking shrinkingly down into the leering face of the dead man. "Clyde never stabbed anyone," she said again. "He couldn't have. And besides, why would he want to? You say he gave this creature a terrible beating. That would be enough. He was no murderer." "Now, ma'am," the detective commented, "I expect we've been round the mulberry bush enough. I can see that you really believe Donovan didn't kill Bursley. If that's so, I don't want to waste my time playing on a dead card, but you can't expect me to take your word for it. You know all about the business, and I don't. The thing for you to do is just to lay your cards on the table like a sensible young woman. Don't be afraid to go into details. I know a good deal already. This lad on the floor, whose face I don't at all like, had some letters or papers of yours that he was threatening to make trouble with. You're a married woman. And I love my husband, and have never loved anyone else. Helen broke in fiercely. He had some letters I wrote years ago, not wicked letters, just silly ones. I know that as well as you do, Forbes assured her. It's the silly letters that make most of the trouble in this world. All love letters ought to be written in vanishing ink. But anyhow, Bursley had them, and he threatened to go to Mr. Riddel with them unless you paid him his price. How about $1,000? He demanded $1,000, Helen said. I thought so. You see, my dear, I've had a lot of experience with birds of his feather, what you might call the vulture tribe. He'd have come back for more, of course. That was what Clyde said. He thought he could get the letters without paying anything. Well, I fancy he did. Bursley seems to have done something of a business in blackmailing, but there was only one document on the place, and that didn't concern you. Yes, I fancy Donovan cleaned him out after putting him under the table, but by that time he was too mad to be reasonable. He went a step farther, and murder is murder. Clyde never stabbed anyone. He couldn't have. Helen Riddel sobbed. Then where is he now? Why didn't he call you up? Why didn't he show up at the office today? Helen's eyes were wide with fright. I don't know, she whispered. Where can he have gone? Inspector Forbes glanced at his watch. Just time to get you back inside the half hour, he muttered. Come, I'll take you home. You can trust me, Mrs. Riddel. I won't haul you into this if I don't actually have to. Chapter 5. A hard-boiled lady. Forbes returned his unwilling witness to her home and immediately drove back to the brick building where the murder had occurred. His lips were pursed, his eyes meditative, as he went up the stairs to the death room. Standing against the wall with the door closed, he looked broodingly down at the body. An expression of extreme dislike appeared in his steely eyes. Killing is a lot too good for you and your kind, my friend, he remarked aloud. But there isn't any way made and provided for in the statutes for getting you out of the way. Now let's see. His glance went slowly and methodically around the room. It was scantily furnished, with unmistakable evidence of the fight that must have preceded the murder. This chap Donovan certainly gave him a lacing, Forbes thought. Doc says one rib is busted and there are welts all over his body. He tried to fight back, but his gun must have been knocked out of his hand before he had a chance to use it. It was clear back against the wall, under the bed. Hadn't been fired, only the dead man's fingerprints on it. Yes, Donovan beat him up and did a thorough job. He got possession of the letters, and then he stabbed him? What with? Doc says the death weapon had at least a 6-inch blade, stabbed him under the arm. Why the deuce did he do that? And why did he take the knife away with him? This case seemed obvious enough, but nothing is more dangerous than an obvious murder. Inspector Forbes had no intention of following a red herring and being shown up in court as a fool. This Riddel woman is a good clean type, he reflected, and I'm not the man to brush aside the hunches of such as her. She knew Donovan. I'll have to go into that a little deeper, I expect. But there's nothing crooked about her, I'll wager. She knew him well enough to go to him when she needed a friend. And she says he wouldn't have stabbed anybody. It's always hard to say what any given party will or won't do. But a woman will come closer to hitting the truth than a man any time. All right, suppose we say he didn't stab Bursley. Who did? And when? And why? It was done after the fight. How long after? One of Inspector Forbes's handicaps in this case had been the lack of witnesses, even indirect ones, in the neighborhood. No one had been at home when the battle took place. The other roomers in the old brick building were a shady lot, and he knew he would have gotten a whisper out of some of them if they had known anything. But the building had been practically deserted between 9 and 11. The grifters and the mouchers had been out, reaping their evening harvest. Half a dozen folks could have come and gone, Forbes realized. Suppose we make another grab into the bag and see what we can bring out. He slid his hand into an inside pocket and produced a letter. It was addressed to Miss Gwendolyn St. John, Hunter's Theatre. The cancellation stamp showed that it had been posted 2 years ago. Exhibit B, Inspector Forbes muttered, also found on the floor, covered with a newspaper. There isn't any Hunter's Theatre in this town, but as it happens, there is a Miss Gwendolyn St. John close at hand, and I think I'll just drop in and have a little chat with her. As he went out into the hall, he paused to speak to the patrolman on guard at the door. They'll be sending up for his nibs, Inspector Forbes explained, but I want you to stick around for a while longer. Just go inside and keep quiet. You might snap off the light if you feel like it, and don't lock the door. If anyone comes inside, grab him. I'll be back in an hour or so. The call Forbes purposed making was in the neighborhood, so he left his car in front of the brick tenement and walked briskly along the street, his eyes, from force of habit, taking in the shop windows and the faces of pedestrians. At the door of a flat building, he paused to consult his notebook. Number 312, probably on the 3rd floor, he murmured. No elevator, we'll walk up. This he promptly did. The halls were dark, and odors of cooking pervaded the place. Inspector Forbes made his way quietly upward and eventually stopped before the door of number 312. For a moment, he stood with his ear against an upper panel, shamelessly listening. However, his moral turpitude went for nothing. He stepped back and knocked. Footsteps sounded at once. He heard a chain rattle, and then the door swung open just far enough to show the face of a woman of 30 or thereabouts. A keen, suspicious-looking face, still rather pretty in spite of a too liberal use of paint and powder. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice edged with hostility. Inspector Forbes mentally classified her. Hard-boiled, out for the money, but not quite clever enough to get much. Trusts no one, couldn't understand an honest man to save her soul. But his words were pacific enough. "Miss St. John, I'd like a little talk with you, if you can spare the time. I'm from police headquarters, but don't let that worry you. Just a little routine matter I thought you might be able to help me with." She tried to slam the door in his face, but his foot had been thrust into the aperture. On the other hand, Inspector Forbes couldn't shove his way in because of the short, strong chain that had been hooked into place. For a long moment, they faced each other silently. Then, with a contemptuous shrug, Miss St. John unfastened the chain and opened the door. "Come in," she said, "though I'm sure I don't know what you want with me." Forbes didn't enlighten her at once. He stood with the closed hall door at his back, calmly looking over the room before him. It was gaudily furnished. There was too much gilt and tinsel, too many things that pretended to be one thing but were another. He saw that even the neat sectional bookcase facing him was a dummy, probably. It concealed Miss St. John's liquor supply, or even an opium layout. Her narrowed eyes were fastened on his as he looked around. "Well?" she said surlily. "I'm not looking for hooch or dope," the detective assured her. "Just a little routine matter, as I've said. In fact, if you'll answer one question promptly and truthfully, I won't bother you further. Where were you last night between 9 o'clock and 11? Quick, let's have it." But he had to wait at least 30 seconds before he received his answer. "That's easy. I was at the Bijou Theatre, in my dressing room or on the stage." "Not very prompt," Inspector Forbes commented. "Are you sure you were there every minute?" "I certainly was." "That's better. Now how about this?" He flashed the envelope before her eyes. Unexpectedly, she made a leap forward and almost tore the letter from his hand. "Ah, naughty, naughty," he said. "Mustn't snatch. You were brought up better than that." "Just come across with my property," the woman facing him snarled. "Don't bother with your cheap humor. You cops are a funny lot, all right, but I don't feel like laughing at you just now. Give me that letter. You admit that it's yours, do you?" She bit her lip. Her angry eyes bored into his. "It has my name on it." "It certainly isn't yours," she declared. "You never can tell. I've got it, and that's something. Now, how would you like to revise that statement of yours about where you were last night between 9 and 11? "I was at the Bijou," she said sullenly. "Give me that letter." "No, I'm not going to give it to you. I might have traded it for the truth about your whereabouts. I told you the truth." She was almost panting, in a vicious, feline way. Inspector Forbes felt that his series of verbal darts had accomplished its purpose. She knew more than she was willing to tell, he was certain of that. But for the present, he would not be able to go further. "All right," he said negligently. "I just thought I'd drop in and see what you had to say." He turned and laid his hand on the doorknob. Over his shoulder, he flashed a last look at the actress. Her lips were still parted. Her eyes were hot and questioning. She seemed about to speak, but the next moment, she closed her teeth with a click and pressed her lips firmly. "Not yet," the detective realized philosophically. "Well, I'll give her all the rope she wants." He went down into the street, and from a corner drugstore called Headquarters, 2 plainclothes men joined him 5 minutes later. One of the pair was the understudy who had located Gwendolyn St. John for Inspector Forbes. He knew her by sight. "Don't bother her unless she tries to fly the coop," Forbes commanded. "Let her run around all she wants to, but keep tabs on anyone she talks to. I'll go over to the Bijou myself and check up on what she says about last night." Chapter 6. Under the microscope. The case had already entered the footwork stage, Inspector Forbes realized. Sooner or later, they all did, milling around, following up this lead and that, hoping to stumble upon a flimsy thread of evidence. That was the trouble with murder cases. In a robbery, there were always stoolies. Professional thieves were known to each other, and eventually someone would pretty much rumble. But murder, unless it was a professional job, wasn't apt to be simplified in this way. "I just have to wear out my shoes like any other roughneck with a strong back and a weak head," Forbes thought discontentedly. "Well, here's the Bijou. Let's see what we can dig up about the lady." Not so much of a lady either, he reflected as he presented himself at the stage door and accosted the surly-faced watchman on guard. Forbes hadn't formed any tender attachment for Miss Gwendolyn St. John. The guardian of the stage door inspected the detective's badge without enthusiasm. "Yeah?" he said. "And what do you want?" "You stick around here pretty steady all evening, I suppose?" Forbes asked. "If I didn't, the show would bust up. 40 young Johnnies a night, on the average, try to crash this door. Well, that ties you down. From the time the show opens till it closes, you're right here, the iron-faced boy that keeps the show going. No one gets in without your approval, but anyone can get out if they want to, of course. The actors and actresses. The men can go out when they want to," his informant interrupted. "The girls can't go out till their act is over for the night." "Why not?" "Orders of the management. One of them went out one night and didn't come back, eloped or got soused. And besides, we ain't going to have our girls standing around on street corners, between acts, talking with fellows. Some of them will do it if they get a chance." "Yes, I expect they would. So when a girl comes on, in the evening, she's here till she goes off. At what time?" "That depends on the evening. Wednesdays and Sundays we give a late show. That keeps them here till about midnight." Inspector Forbes reflected that, as today was Thursday, Miss St. John's alibi for the previous evening was pretty convincing. He didn't want to mention her by name, if he didn't have to. This guardian of the honor of the stage looked as if he might wag a wicked tongue when it came to the pastime of gossip. But there was another possibility. The previous evening had been warm, and Forbes noted that the watchman's chair, tonight, had been placed close to the end of his little lane, within 2 feet of the sidewalk. Forbes turned and stared reflectively in the opposite direction. Mostly darkness there. He could check up on that detail presently. "No one sick or otherwise absent last night?" he asked. "Sickness ain't no excuse. Sick or well, they got a report. If a girl is dead, That's different. Also, orders of the management, I suppose, the inspector murmured. So they were all here last night? Yes, they was. Well, I'm glad to hear it. A group of girls came hurrying toward the stage door from the street. Forbes moved silently in the opposite direction, into the shadow end of the narrow lane that flanked the theatre building. See you later, he added. He had to grope his way through the darkness, but after stumbling 100 feet or so along a narrow concrete walk, he came out into an alley. A grim smile twisted his lips. All the St. John woman had to do was to watch her chance and slip out behind the watchman's back. By turning left rather than right, she wouldn't have to encounter his formidable glare. The alley led into the side street. Inspector Forbes consulted his watch, then went briskly forward. In less than 5 minutes, he arrived in front of the brick building where the murder had taken place. Yes, she would have had no difficulty in getting here and getting back, between acts. Forbes went up 2 flights of stairs and entered the unlighted room where he had left the policeman on guard. The solitary officer reported that nothing had happened. There had been no visitors, although he had heard the other rumors passing along the hall. More footwork, this time only figurative. Inspector Forbes went down to his car and drove to the headquarters building. In his little office, he found a memorandum left by the plainclothes man who had been sent out to gather facts on the dead man's previous activities. There was quite a little docket. Theo Bursley had been known as Marks. He had been in the city nearly 2 months, but there was no evidence that he had been up to anything out of the way until recently. About 2 weeks ago, a patrolman in the lower part of the city had brought him in, together with a well-dressed young man, obviously both scared and excited. They had been arguing loudly, had been on the point of fighting. Marks had refused to talk. His companion had demanded that his attorney be called, and a well-known family lawyer had come to the station and managed to get the thing hushed up. Now both the attorney and his client were out of town for an indefinite time. Blackmail, and they won't do a thing to help us, Forbes realized. A nice case all the way around. Blackmail cases were usually like that. The only victims of extortion who ever fought back were hard-headed middle-aged businessmen who knew better than to yield to the first demand, and usually they were made to look so foolish and despicable before the thing died out in the newspapers that all the other victims were scared into submission. It's no good, Inspector Forbes told himself. I'm getting old, and I never was very bright. I wouldn't have been a detective if I had had any brains. Just a roughneck policeman, no education, no friends, nothing. I ought to go and hop into the bay. But at this moment the office door opened, and a debonair-looking young man, with his featherweight felt hat a trifle on one side and an airy whistle on his lips, came into the room. Forbes began to glower. This medical examiner always set his teeth on edge. "So here you are," he growled inhospitably. "Well, don't spring any of your stuff because I won't stand it, see? I don't know anything about detecting, and I'm not supposed to. I'm a fool. But there's one thing, I'm not the only one around here. I haven't got a big microscope and a lot of bottles and glass tubing strung all over the place. I don't know human blood from red ink or raspberry juice, and at that, I know as much as the medical examiner. Why don't you go over to France or to Germany or to England and learn how to examine evidence? Those babies over there can take a hair and tell you all about the man that shed it, or they can take a spoonful of lint and dust off a man's coat and tell you where he's been and what he's done. You're a big help, you are." Young Dr. Alex Giddings continued to go through the motions of whistling, but no sound issued from his puckered lips. His eyes widened slightly, and he seemed overcome by amazement. "Inspector," he asked in a hushed voice, "are you a mind reader?" "Go on, spring it," Forbes grunted. "Well, if you're not, Old Man Coincidence has some explaining to do. Do you know what I came in here for?" "I don't know why you ever come in here," Forbes said unkindly. "I could get along without you." "Don't say that. You'll regret it in a minute. You said I ought to go to Europe to learn how to use a microscope in criminology. Well, I didn't go there, but I did spend my last vacation with a man out in California, a policeman who knows his business. They call him the scientific cop, and let me tell you, he doesn't have to go to Paris or to Berlin to ask how to handle his end of things. I've heard of him, Forbes admitted, but what's that got to do with me? Kind of self-centered tonight, aren't you? The young medical man suggested. However, I don't blame you. But just come over to my place and I'll show you something. In spite of himself, Inspector Forbes was impressed. This irritating young fellow had always had a suggestion of competence about him, and now he seemed more in earnest than Forbes had ever known him to be. The inspector stood up, locked his desk, and followed him out into the hall and around to the alley door. Soon they were passing through the hallway that led past the morgue and into the offices at the rear. Dr. Giddings unlocked a door and motioned for his companion to enter. The room beyond was brightly lit. A bench ran around 3 walls, and on this bench were all the paraphernalia Forbes had so slightingly mentioned: microscopes, cameras, flasks, beakers, and condensers. The medical expert crossed to one of the microscopes, stooped over it for a moment, and then, with a rather theatrical gesture, straightened up. "Have a look at that," he commanded. "I took it out from under the dead man's fingernails." Chapter 7. Jim demands an answer. In her return home after her visit with Inspector Forbes, Helen Riddle's first feeling was one of infinite relief. Clyde was not dead. Bursley was. For a short time, these 2 facts seemed all that mattered. The Chinese tub. But the inevitable mental reaction set in. Long before Jim had returned from his committee meeting, she had begun to worry. Why had Clyde disappeared? Was it possible that he had actually killed Bursley with a dagger or knife? At first, she was firmly convinced that this was out of the question. Clyde Donovan was the last man in the world to resort to anything so un-American. He would use his fists, or in a dire emergency even a revolver, if one was at hand. But he would never stab anyone. The more she thought about the matter, however, the more confused and uncertain she became. Bursley might have drawn his knife in keeping with his character, and she felt Clyde might have wrested it from him and struck the fatal blow. Then he had run for it, but that also was out of character, and she felt herself more and more baffled. There was just one possibility which was in keeping with what she knew of the rather rugged-minded young fellow who had been her brother's friend. Clyde must have been desperately wounded, or perhaps he had been killed outright. But in that case, where was his body? There is nothing more wearing and nerve-shattering than continued silence in a case of this kind. Jim returned, preoccupied by the events of his evening. Helen continued to think over and over again the little round of baffling thoughts. Clyde hadn't done it, or had he? He had run away, or perhaps he had been killed. She reached a point where she would gladly have dismissed the whole terrible affair from her mind, but by this time she had lost control of her image-forming machinery. Vivid and terrible pictures presented themselves, in swift and continuous succession. It was at breakfast time, the next morning, that she first became aware of a change in her husband's manner toward her. Jim was very quiet, but his eyes from time to time sought her face. She met one of those lingering glances, and suddenly her heart missed a beat. What did that expression mean? There was something sultry and unpleasant in it. She sat looking steadily at Jim. He smiled and resumed his eating. But his smile wasn't a pleasant one, and he uttered not a word to explain it. Here was a change of thought at any rate. Helen suddenly began to ask herself if Jim could suspect anything. Suppose he hadn't been at a board meeting last night. Suppose he had been watching her, but he had come home in his usual after-business mood. No, he had been all right till now. Helen stole a glance at him from the corners of her eyes. He was stealthily regarding her. "What's the trouble, dear?" she asked, her voice cool and pleasant in spite of her disturbance. "Nothing." He was certainly angry or suspicious about something. She tried to think of a possible explanation other than the logical one. She could think of nothing. But Jim was not going to explain. He maintained a sulky silence throughout the remainder of the meal and went off to his office without another word. He didn't kiss her goodbye, and that was final proof, if she had needed any. Throughout the day she kept to her rooms. She left a door partly open so that she could hear the telephone. Occasionally it rang, and she hurried to answer it before one of the maids could do so. Various acquaintances called. Helen each time excused herself on the plea of having a headache. She both hoped and feared that Inspector Forbes might call her, but no word came from the police. By afternoon, her headache was a very real affair. She felt sick and dizzy. Aspirin didn't help, so she sat by the window and looked wearily out over the lawn. A Robin family, consisting apparently of 2 harried parents, 2 overgrown and very greedy children with spotted breasts, and a bachelor uncle, helped her center her attention on something outside her swirling anxieties. The bachelor uncle evidently disapproved of the way in which the younger generation was being brought up. On one occasion, he hopped up behind one of the gobbling children and, unperceived by either parent, appropriated a fat angle worm which had a moment before been thrust into a gaping pink mouth. Then he administered his idea of a peck and turned his back. Helen smiled wanly. The robins flew away, and long shadows began to form across the close-clipped turf. Evening was at hand. She felt all of a sudden that she couldn't stand another moment of this silent, mocking house. She must get out, or she would smother. She went quickly down into the hall and let herself out. A half-hour walk immensely refreshed her. She came slowly back along the quiet evening street. As she went up the steps of her own house, the front door swung open before her, and Jim Riddel stood looking out and down, his lips parted and quivering, a pasty green shadow tinging his usually ruddy cheeks. "Come in here," he said. "I want to talk to you." Helen paused, then came up the remaining steps and entered the house. Jim slammed the door. "This way," he said, his voice trembling. He went before her into the east room. As Helen crossed the threshold, Jim again closed the door, this time shutting them both into the room overlooking the garden. For a moment she thought they were alone, but the next moment she saw the maid, Beatrice, standing meekly in a corner. "I want the truth about this business out of you," Jim said. He had switched on a light, and by it she saw that he really was green or yellow. Certainly there was a tinge of color in his face he had never seen there before. For an instant she was so interested in this phenomenon that she hardly heard his question or statement. Actually, his teeth were chattering. He stared at her, his eyes wide and unnatural. "Will you talk?" he snarled. Offhand, Helen Riddel would have said that such a situation at this point would have frightened her. Confronted by it, however, she unexpectedly found herself tingling with anger. "Are you sick, Jim?" she asked. "If you are, I'll overlook what you've said." "Overlook it?" He began to laugh. His voice was metallic and high-pitched. In a woman, the seizure would have been called hysteria. "Stop it!" Helen commanded, stamping her foot. "What is Beatrice doing here?" Beatrice looked slyly at her mistress and then at Jim Riddel. "I think I ought to go," she murmured, her voice as soft as a spring breeze. "Not much you won't. Not till you've told my wife what you told me. If you've lied, I'll strangle you. Go ahead, spill it out." "Ask Mrs. Riddel if I've lied," the maid said quietly. "Ask her about the man who came here night before last. She talked with him for a moment in this room, and then she took him out when you came home. He was there when you came home. He was there while you ate dinner, and after you'd gone out for the evening, Mrs. Riddel went out to him again." Jim made a fizzling noise, as if he had drunk too much lemon soda. Helen looked at him with arched brows. Then she turned back to Beatrice. "Go on," she commanded coldly. "Finish your story." "Yes, finish it," Jim grated. "I see it's all true. Mrs. Riddel went out to the summer house as soon as she was sure you wouldn't come back. She wasn't there long the second time, but she just came back to the house long enough to get her coat and hat. When you called, she was still away. I lied to you, sir, and my conscience has been bothering me ever since." Helen smiled. The little troublemaker, Beatrice, was having the time of her life. But, save for minor inaccuracies which were not worth calling attention to, her story was correct, and it did make things look bad. Poor Jim. However, a woman, even a very nice one, can say "poor Jim," and proceed to carve Jim's heart out and hold it, palpitating before his face. Helen was enraged, but her anger took a different form from her husband's. It made her cold as one of those frosted pipes in a butcher's window. Her voice was low and steady. "You poor child," she said, smiling at Beatrice. "How you must have suffered." "I tried to do what was right, but I shouldn't have lied," the girl murmured, stealing a look of malicious triumph at her mistress. "When that gentleman called for you last night—" "Last night again?" Jim shrieked. "You didn't tell me that. You didn't give me a chance, sir. You got in such a passion I couldn't make myself heard." "What a delightful tete-a-tete you two must have had," Helen observed. "Where did it take place? In the kitchen? I should imagine that would be the proper setting." "Never mind where it took place. What have you got to say about it?" Jim panted. "Come, I'm waiting." "Don't let me hinder you," his wife said with an acid sweetness that made his lips twitch. "Keep right on waiting, Jim. If you fancy I'm going to take part in any such sordid affair as this, you certainly have gone crazy." She felt as cool and collected as she had ever felt in her life. She walked past her husband, who was standing with his feet braced apart near the door, and, without another word, went into the hall and along toward the front of the house. She opened the street door, stood for a moment looking into the darkness, and then went down the steps to the walk. Of course, that kind of calm couldn't last. She suddenly found herself crying. She drew out her handkerchief and dabbed at her tears. What should she do? What could she do? If she had only told Jim in the first place, everything would have been, but it wouldn't. Everything would have been all wrong, just as it was now. Of course, Jim's mind was thoroughly poisoned, and he was burning up with jealousy and the rage it kindled. But he would have been unreasonable and impossible, even if she had taken him into her confidence right from the start, and her conscience told her that she had done nothing wrong, from beginning to end, in all this wild, crazy series of misadventures. She was simply caught in the wheels of a great stupid machine and was being torn to bits. A lethargy of despair succeeded the tears and turmoil stage. She walked on and on, not realizing the direction her feet were taking her, until suddenly she saw, in the obscurity of an alley she was passing, a twisted, evil face. She stared back, startled and frightened. Then she was hurrying on, but now she was vividly aware of her surroundings. She was in a street occupied by cheap restaurants, cheap clothing stores, the doors of which were still open for business, and pawnbroking establishments. Furtive steps came on behind her. She passed villainous-looking men, many of them Orientals. Her lips parted, and she looked wildly about for a cab. As she reached the corner, she saw before her, on the farther side of the street, a brick building. Her mind seemed to swing round and adjust itself. She knew now where she was. Fear and abhorrence, which are as strong attractive forces as hope and approval, had drawn her back to the neighborhood of the murder. It was over there, in one of those mysterious upper rooms, that Theo Bursley had been killed. She paused, her eyes swinging up, and then she started and cried out, for a hand had been laid on her arm. "You shouldn't come here alone, ma'am," Inspector Forbes said with obvious disapproval. "Were you looking for me?" "No, yes, I don't know why I came," Helen whispered. Tears again welled into her eyes. "I just had a terrible scene with my husband," she added, impelled by something strong and dependable in the face of this police officer to tell her troubles. "He doesn't know anything about this business?" Forbes inquired. "Well, Jim is so unreasonably jealous. He knows, when he's in his right mind, that I love him and him only. But if any little thing he doesn't understand happens, He seems to go crazy. The maid talked. Maids always do. So you had a scene with hubby and decided to make things better by walking, alone, down below the deadline. It's lucky I came along just when I did. I'll take you home and you stick there till you hear from me. As for Jim, I'll look into his case. I don't promise you anything, mind, but I rather hope to be able to put a bee in his bonnet. In pretty much of a daze by this time, Helen Riddel allowed herself to be assisted into the inspector's car and driven home. Jim was nowhere about when she entered the lower hall. She went to her room. The house was silent. She was apparently quite alone in it. She locked her door, undressed quickly, and went to bed. Chapter 8. The Tub. Prior to his accidental meeting with Helen Riddel, Inspector Forbes had spent a busy day. The glimpse the medical examiner had given him through the microscope had set him on a new track, but at the same time, he had to stay on top of all the leads he had uncovered earlier. For one thing, he wanted to track down Clyde Donovan. But that silly young fool had gone off the grid so completely that Forbes couldn't get a whisper from the undertow about him or his whereabouts. If he didn't kill Marks or Bursley, what is he hiding from us for? The detective asked himself discontentedly. And if he did kill them? Well, in that case, young Dr. Giddings had better return to Berkeley and take another summer course in criminology. The trouble with that lad is that he leaves all the real work to me, Forbes thought. He says, look at this, and after you've looked at it, go out and pick up your man. Well, that's what I get paid for. During that eventful day, Inspector Forbes hired an assistant. One of his challenges was that the neighborhood below the deadline was largely occupied by Orientals and other foreigners, and Forbes was no linguist. To help him sort through his pile of evidence, he chose a yellow-faced youth who looked distinctly Chinese, but dressed in modern American clothing. His attire was stylish, and he carried more fountain pens and pencils than Forbes had ever seen in his own pocket. The detective decided on this assistant late in the afternoon. He had considered several others, but had dismissed them after brief trials. He and Charlie Hinn, the successful candidate, had a conversation in a basement restaurant. Yes, Charlie had known Marks. So had the others. Did he know anything in particular about him? Anything that could explain his murder? The almond-shaped eyes of Charlie Hinn studied Forbes with a cryptic gaze. A death by violence is in the stars and in the palm of the hand, Charlie said in his low, resonant voice. When the soul of a man who is to die by the knife is born into this world, the ghosts of his ancestors bow their heads, for they know the hour and the moment are already appointed. Now that's nice and helpful, Forbes muttered, but what does it mean? The words of the wise are not to be interpreted by fools, Charlie said serenely. Oh yes? Present company, of course, accepted. All right, suppose you come up and take a look around the rooms. We might see something together that I've missed. He led the way out of the basement and along the street. 2 flights up, and Forbes drew a key from his pocket and fitted it into the lock. The policeman had been reassigned to his former station. Nothing inside the death room had been changed, except for the absence of the body. Forbes's steady eyes rested on Charlie Hinn. The Chinaman looked impassively around the room, then produced a cigarette, tapped it on his polished nail and lit it. See anything suggestive? Forbes asked. A grain of sand and a drop of water suggest the universe, Charlie replied. Forbes began to flush, and a spark came into his eyes. He said nothing, however, but stood for a moment, looking over the room once more. Afterward, he led the way across to a door at the rear, opened it, and stepped into a lean-to shed that connected with some rickety back stairs. This door had been double-bolted from the inside when the body was found, but today Forbes was particularly interested in what lay beyond it. There was a narrow shelf against one wall, littered with broken dishes and empty tin cans that had once held food. The floor was dirty and scattered with seemingly insignificant odds and ends, but in one corner was a Chinese tub. which had evidently been placed there to catch the drip from a hole in the roof. Now the man from headquarters stood, looking down into the water-filled container. Something glimmered at the bottom of the water. "Come in here, Charlie," Forbes said over his shoulder. The Chinaman was immediately at his elbow. "What do you make of that?" Forbes demanded, pointing to the glimmering object. There was no reply, only a faint shrug. "Oh, so that's what you think?" the detective commented. "Well, just get it out for me, will you?" Charlie Hinn, without a word, thrust his hand down into the tub and brought out a small circular piece of tin. His sleeve was dripping as he handed it to Forbes, and a faint, mocking smile lingered around his slanting eyes. Inspector Forbes stood staring down at the little tin disc in his hand. "Ah, Charlie, Charlie," he said softly, "a little grain of sand and a little drop of water, and my little tin wheel, cut from the top of a salmon can. Come, we have finished here." They went out through the death room. Inspector Forbes closed and locked the door. "I'm going down to headquarters," he commented. "I want you to stick around and use your eyes and ears. Report to me tonight, same place I picked you up before. Have you any questions you want to ask?" "The fool asks, the sage sees," Charlie Hinn replied, "which means no." "All right, tonight at 8. Inspector Forbes went directly to the headquarters building, where he summoned into his little office an astute-looking young man, who often did the society end of difficult cases. "Here's a name and address," Forbes explained, handing the plainclothes man a slip of paper. "I want you to look up this guy, Riddel, and see what you can get on him. I want a twitch on his nose. I want him fixed so he'll be easy to handle. He's kicking up a row in this Marks murder case, and I've got to throw a chill into him some way. He's one of these insanely jealous Johnnies, and pretty generally you'll discover they aren't quite on the level themselves. Just dig around a bit and see if he's been up to anything he wouldn't like the world to know about." A varied and sundry day it was, Inspector Forbes reflected when he was again left alone. Everything from tin discs to unofficial blackmail, forcing an unruly husband to get back into line. He shouldn't wonder if Huffner would get something on this guy Riddel. He shouldn't wonder, but that was only a small detail, and the others weren't going so well. It was time for him to pull his big scene. If he could pull it tonight, he would have the thing all settled up in no time. He had most of the factors in his hand, but still he wasn't ready to go to bat. One item more, the whereabouts of Clyde Donovan. Where had the idiot taken himself to? For a moment, Forbes had an uneasy feeling. Suppose that Donovan also had been murdered? But he didn't think so, and in any case that wasn't a proviso he could act on. It was not for him to question why, but to keep plugging along, hoping for the best. Late that night, the two detectives he had set to watch Gwendolyn St. John came to headquarters in a taxicab, bringing the actress with them. "She tried to run for it, Inspector," the elder of the pair explained. "We let her go as far as the railroad station, then tagged her and brought her in." "Correct," Forbes replied. He stared through steely eyes at the flushed and angry woman. "So you were headed for out, were you?" he added. "I'll make you pay for this," she said, giving him look for look. "I'll make you wish that you'd never heard of me. If I were to believe every party that tells me that, I'd figure I ought to have been born deaf," the inspector assured her. "Are you ready to talk?" "I've told you all that I know." "Lock her up," Forbes said, turning on his heel. "If she raises a holler about a lawyer, book her as an accessory before the fact in the Marks murder." That shook her, he saw as he darted a last look at her. But she wasn't ready to come clean yet. Let her think it over a while in her cell. He wasn't quite ready for her story anyhow. He knew about what it would be when she told all of it. The great building quieted down, and the sound of traffic from the avenue in front became but a subdued murmur. Forbes stifled a yawn and consulted his watch. Nearly midnight, and he had slept but little the night before and the night before that. If only that fellow Donovan could be picked up. But, at last, he went into the property clerk's office, where there was an army cot and a blanket. Inspector Forbes lay down in all of his clothing, except his hat. He fell asleep, hoping to hear his name called, to learn that the missing link in his chain of evidence had been found. But now the headquarters building was as silent as a cemetery at midnight. Chapter 9. An Arrest. Forbes was up at dawn and had breakfasted at the all-night restaurant across from the station. Then, until time for the day shift to come on, he talked with the night captain and with a burly corporal in charge of the switchboard. Huffner, the detective Forbes had sent out to investigate Jim Riddle's record, came in early, with a crafty, satisfied look on his face. "I got him, Inspector," he said. "If friend-wife knows what he's been up to these last few evenings, I miss my guess." "Not another dame?" Inspector Forbes asked. "Well, yes and no. You see, this bird, Riddle, is on an entertainment committee for the wholesale men's clothing merchants, and they've been getting a show ready for the out-of-town buyers, who are due tomorrow night. That is, the show is billed for them, and it's a snappy review. Take it from me." Huffner went into details. Forbes listened and nodded. "That ought to be about right," he commented. "I'll just drop in and have a talk with our friend." He found Jim Riddle already seated at his desk, ploughing through a stack of letters to which he was dictating replies. The man from headquarters came into the private office with a slow and impressive step. His formidable gaze transfixed the businessman. Riddle hastily dismissed his stenographer. "What is it, officer?" he demanded, after Forbes had shown his shield. "Why, mister, it's about an entertainment you commercial gents have been rehearsing, behind locked doors, for the last few evenings. A report has been turned in on it. Something about a young woman who does a dance on the table, and afterward passes around something that isn't sweet cider to the guests. You remember that theatrical gent that spent some time down at Atlanta for putting on the wrong kind of a dinner?" Jim's eyes bulged. He sat slumped back in his chair, staring glassily at his visitor. He had begun to perspire. "For heaven's sake, officer, isn't there some way this thing can be hushed up?" he inquired, his voice raised hardly above a whisper. "If my wife was to hear of it." "Oh, you're a married man, are you? Well, that doesn't make it any better. You ought to be ashamed, skipping around down there and trying to ogle this toe dancer." "Hush it up? What do you mean, hush it up? Are you trying to bribe me?" He looked so fiercely at Jim Riddle that the latter for a moment turned his harried eyes aside. "Really, officer," Jim muttered, "I don't know what to do. I didn't see any harm in the thing. These buyers are all out-of-town men, and they expect us to put on something snappy for their entertainment. I take the full responsibility for this feature you object to. There's nothing wrong about it as far as I'm concerned, I assure you. I've hardly spoken to the young lady." "Hardly spoken to her?" "Well, I had to explain to her what we wanted. You explained about the costume and the stuff on the table, I suppose? What does your wife think of it all? Doesn't she object?" Jim mopped his face on his handkerchief. "I don't trouble my wife about business affairs," he explained. "She wouldn't be interested." "Well, I guess I'll go around and talk with her about it. Women have a kind of intuition in these kinds of things, and if she gives you a clean bill of health, I'll be inclined to drop it." Inspector Forbes knew that he was running close to the wind. Of course, these old coots were putting on a show that would undoubtedly shock sensitive-minded elderly people, but there was nothing intrinsically wrong with it. If he pushed the thing too far, he was apt to be called up before the chief to explain. Well then, he must substitute suggestion and innuendo for harsher methods. Jim Riddle said, "I'd rather you didn't bother my wife with this, officer. I'd rather she didn't know anything about it." "I'll think it over," Inspector Forbes replied. "I ought to talk with her, but I'll see what can be done. Just keep this under your hat, and I'll do my best for you." And there was another detail out of the way, he mused, as he went down into the street and climbed into his car. Jim would be in a condition of uncertainty. He wouldn't know whether or not Helen had been informed of his recent activities as an entertainer. With that bee buzzing around in his bonnet, he won't have much spunk left to chevy Mrs. Riddle, the detective decided. I don't think he will make any more bother." Inspector Forbes returned to his office and gloomily read the notes on his desk. He listened to the reports of some of the men who had been sent out to pick up Clyde Donovan. Nothing had been heard of the fugitive. Apparently, he had left the city. Forbes took up the search in person that day. In company with Charlie Hinn, he visited every obscure lodging house in the quarter below the dead line. From time to time, the two men looked cryptically at each other. "You think I won't catch him?" Forbes demanded. "When the sage pursues, he sits with his eyes closed," the Chinaman replied. For an instant, there was almost a sneer about his thin lips, meaning he uses his head instead of his feet, the inspector said softly. "And you think I'm not smart enough to do that, Charlie Hinn? Do you remember the tub, and the water, and the little tin disc?" The pupils of Forbes' steely eyes contracted for an instant to pin points. He stared down at the man at his side. Then they were walking on, down a street faced by Chinese houses, with carved red and gilt balconies. But Donovan had apparently stepped off the earth into the fourth dimension. Forbes called headquarters from time to time, but nothing had been heard of the missing man there. And so the day passed, and evening again was descending over the city. The two men, so oddly paired, had eaten and drunk together. They spoke but little but something. An unspoken but mutually understood tie held them with their shoulders almost touching. As dusk thickened into darkness, Inspector Forbes paused and stood thinking. "Hinn, my friend," he said after a time of frowning consideration, "I have a feeling that some folks would call a hunch tonight. I believe we're close to the end of our search. Come, what is it the Frenchmen say? Look for the dame? Let us look up the woman in the case. Into the car with you." In the police car, they drove across the city. Forbes parked beside a church and climbed out. "Come," he said again. The Riddel house was around the corner, but, as they were quietly approaching it, Inspector Forbes suddenly saw a figure slide from one clump of shrubbery over at the right to another. Someone was approaching the side window, looking upon the lawn. "Come," he said for the third time, but now he spoke through his teeth. "After him, Hinn. The race perhaps is not always to the swift, but on the present occasion, Inspector Forbes's long legs were a deciding factor. He was good for a sprint, he knew, but his wind wouldn't hold out for any marathon. So he put his heart into the matter, and in less than 30 seconds after he had spotted that mysterious figure, slipping from bush to bush, he had collared it. Forbes was puffing, but he held his prisoner by the shoulder and slid his free hand to his gun. "It's quite all right, officer," the black-haired, rugged-faced man before him said. "No need for that. I'll come along peaceably." "Your name is Donovan?" "I'm Clyde Donovan. I was coming in after I talked with Mrs. after I got through with one little detail, to give myself up." "You took your time about it," the man from headquarters grumbled. "But I have you now. Do you want to see my warrant?" "No need for that," the younger man said quietly again. "I'm willing to come with you." Chapter 10. Forbes explains. 5 people sat in the room where Theo Bursley had been murdered, and a 6th stood with his broad shoulders against the door leading into the hall. Charlie Hinn's chair was placed against the other door, the one leading into the small lean-to porch connecting with the back stairs. "Don't let anyone out there, Charlie," Inspector Forbes said. His hand groped at his back. "Yes, the hall door was bolted. And now, Miss Gwendolen St. John, or whatever your name really is, we're ready to listen to you," the detective added. Gwendolen St. John sat in a corner. At her left was Helen Riddel. At her right, the jaunty-looking young medical examiner. She raised her sullen eyes and stared at Forbes. "What do you want me to say?" she demanded. "The truth. That yarn of yours about having been at the Bijou all evening won't wash, you know. You sneaked out the stage door when the watchman was sitting near the street, and you went out by way of the alley. You came straight over here. It took you less than 5 minutes because you were in a hurry. You came up here. Now tell it." The actress' lips twitched, and there was an unhealthy pallor on her cheeks. Forbes stood studying her. She wouldn't hold out. "If I tell the truth, will you let me go tonight?" she demanded, her voice low and unsteady. "Tell your story, and we'll see. I'll do my best for you. If you don't come clean, I'll hold you for the grand jury. That may sew you up for weeks, or even months." She shivered, as if with actual cold. For an instant, her eyes shifted to the rear door, guarded by the seated Chinaman. "All right," she said. "But if you think I killed Marks, you're crazy. Why should I? He was handling a blackmail job for you. He was what might be called your agent." She hesitated, then nodded. Clyde Donovan, seated across the room, stared and slid to the edge of his chair. He seemed about to break in, but a warning glance from Forbes checked him. "If you want to put it that way," Miss St. John muttered. "I'd tried to get a little money out of this young fool, but I couldn't quite get him to come through. He was scared, but his family kept him on a short allowance. Marks said he could make him pay if he had to steal the money. I had to have it." "For dope," Inspector Forbes thought. But what he said was, "All right, what did you come up here for?" "I hadn't heard from Marks for some time. Naturally, I didn't trust him. I got to thinking about it. I was hard up, and I made up my mind I'd tell him either to come across with some money or give me my letters back." "How many were there?" the detective inquired. "8, counting the one you have." Forbes looked at Clyde Donovan. Donovan looked steadily back. "Go on," the inspector commanded. "You came here about what time?" "I should think you'd know that with all your smartness. It was just 10:30 when I got here." "Go on. You came up and what did you see?" "I saw Marks lying below the droplight, dying." "Dying?" The detective's voice was sharp. "How do you know that?" "I've seen people die before. He was breathing about once every 10 seconds and there was a rattle in his throat. What did you do?" "Well, what could I do? I couldn't bring him back to life. I crossed to that box couch and looked into it, but the papers were gone, all of them." Again, for an instant, Inspector Forbes and young Donovan exchanged glances. Then the man from headquarters was staring at the St. John woman. "Was the door open when you came in?" "No, but it wasn't locked. And that door over there." She glanced uncertainly at the rear door. "I think both of those bolts were fastened," she said, "but I wouldn't swear to it." "All right, go on. When you didn't find the papers in the couch, what did you do?" "I got scared all of a sudden. Marks had quit breathing, and his eyes were half open and half shut. He was kind of grinning at me, and I ran for it. Out into the hall, down 2 flights of stairs, into the street. Now, did you see anyone while you were going down?" The actress turned and pointed steadily at Clyde Donovan. "He was coming up as I went down." "Coming back up here, you're sure?" "Yes." He stopped and looked after me. "I know because I turned at the foot of the steps and looked back up at him." Inspector Forbes nodded and turned his unfriendly glance upon Donovan. "Now you," he said grimly. "What have you got to say for yourself?" Clyde shook his head. "Wait a moment," he said. "Let's get this straight. This young woman was in the blackmail business herself? She was in with the fellow I beat up? You heard what she said." Clyde looked angrily around at the faces turned upon him. "Will someone kindly kick me?" he inquired. "I'm the biggest dub in captivity." "All right, Inspector. What is it you want me to tell?" "I want you to tell everything that happened here the night of the murder. Remember, you are not being offered any kind of immunity." "Immunity your grandmother?" Clyde broke in impatiently. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you mean." "And this young woman didn't either, eh? What a fool I am." He shook his head, but resumed before Forbes had a chance to prompt him. "I came up here on some private business which doesn't concern anyone but me. I had my opinion of this fellow, Bursley, or Marks, or whatever his name was, before I came, but he made some remarks directly he learned what my business with him was that were enough to fry the back of your neck. You see, he had a gun in his pocket, and he felt safe. So he told me what he thought about me, and he went on to say some other things. A flush had started up in the speaker's cheeks. He snapped his fingers, looked angrily at the detective, and continued. I didn't let him get far. There are some things no man is going to say around me without having a fight on his hands. I jumped him, and he jerked out his gun. I hit it with the flat of my hand and knocked it under the bed. Then we had it right. He was wiry and full of tricks. He tried to gouge my eyes and to sink his teeth into my throat. It was like fighting an ape or a baboon. But I worked away at his ribs and he began to slow down. Then I let him have it over the ear, and we went down in a heap. And then you stabbed him? Or did you get the letters first? Oh, forget it, Clyde Donovan requested wearily. I didn't stab him. What the deuce would I do that for? I'd taken him to one honest beating, and I had no trouble finding the letters. That was all I wanted with him. You took the letters, and after that, I went down into an alley and burned them. It seemed to be the only thing to do, as I didn't have time to sort out the ones belonging to, the ones I had come for from the others. I didn't want to be lugging other people's love notes around with me. I figured whoever had written them would be best pleased if they were turned into ashes, so I looked after that. And then I went back to Bursley's room, just as this woman has told you. I wanted to be sure I hadn't missed anything. I noticed the scared look on her face as she came down. She kind of shrank against the wall, then went as fast as she could. So, when I got back upstairs and found someone had gotten to him while I was away and had killed him, I thought of her. The speaker paused to give Gwendolyn St. John a scathing look. If I'd known the kind of woman she was, he added indignantly, I wouldn't have bothered to take myself off. So that's your line. You ran away to save the lady? How did you think that would help? Well, I dropped my cigarette case, which I was pretty sure you could trace. I had a notion to put my name and address in it to be sure, and I thought you'd figure I did the killing and look for me. That would give her time to clear out. Inspector Forbes had flushed at the mention of the planted cigarette case. His steely eyes were more unpleasant than usual as he held them unwaveringly on Clyde Donovan. Well, you're not as smart as you probably think you are, he commented. You dropped your cigarette case on purpose, or so you say, but you also dropped one of Miss St. John's letters, and I found it and picked her up. If she's done the killing, but wait a bit. On a low bench against the west wall of the room stood a bulky something covered with a newspaper. Inspector Forbes stepped over it and drew the papers away. The Chinese tub, still filled with water, was revealed. Donovan, there's something in that tub that I want, the inspector said. Just fish it out and hand it to me, will you? Clyde Donovan stared, stood up, and approached the tub. He peered down into it, then with a frown of bewilderment, drew his sleeve above his elbow and dipped his hand down into the water. He drew out a small, shining tin disc and turned with it to Forbes. Though what the deuce you wanted with it, he muttered. I don't see. A chair turned over with a crash. One of the seated figures was up, jerking at the rear door. Charlie Hinn moved so swiftly that he was in the shed before Forbes could do anything to stop him. But the next moment the Chinaman was back in the death room. He ran with amazing speed straight for the inspector. In his right hand was a wicked-looking knife. Inspector Forbes should have been prepared for just this, but the startling quickness of his attacker's movements took him by surprise. The Chinaman struck. Forbes cried out in a thick, protesting voice. Then they were tangled together, flailing about the room, falling over chairs, bumping into walls and stampeding the two women. Shouts and pounding of feet sounded from the rear stairs. 4 plainclothesmen were precipitated into the room as if they had been fired out of a trick cannon. But Hinn had freed his knife hand and had drawn it back for a final, fatal blow. The detectives would have been too late to rescue their chief had it not been for the intervention of Clyde Donovan. With a cry of dismay, he leaped across, stood for a moment sorting out the various arms, legs and heads whirling before him, and then struck. His fist landed with an audible thud, and Inspector Forbes staggered back, releasing his hold on the wiry figure of his enemy. Charlie Hinn dropped to the floor and lay there. his fingers quivering, the Chinese dagger with which he had killed Marks or Bursley, and had so nearly killed Inspector Forbes, lying where it had fallen. The detective had been struck one glancing blow on the wrist. Dr. Giddings, cool and debonair as usual, quickly bandaged it. Then the young medical examiner stood looking down at where Hin, securely handcuffed, was lying. He drew up the Chinaman's sleeves, stooped farther, and uttered an exclamation of triumph. "There you are, Inspector," said he. Cuticle gone from both forearms. Bursley put up a fight for his life. I knew his forearms were scratched yesterday. Inspector Forbes grunted. He was running his handkerchief round the inside of his collar. It had been a hot fight while it lasted. When he stuck his hand down into the tub without hauling up his sleeve, he stopped just a moment, and I could see him thinking it over. You see, I'd tried out everyone else I could locate who had so much as spoken to Marks, and had them up here for the great Chinese tub scene. All the others pulled up their sleeves. Some of them tried to fish it out with a stick, but that round disc couldn't be handled that way. That's why I used it. Miss St. John, there, had a short-sleeved rig on the first time I went up to see her. She was in the clear, no scratches. Donovan was the last man on the list, though I was pretty certain it was Hin by that time. If you'd just come forward, young fellow, so that I could have had your story to fit into the case, for the medical examiner and the preliminary hearing, but you had to go tearing off, protecting the innocent young thing you thought had done the job. I thought he'd been blackmailing her, and if he had, I'd have let them hang me rather than betray her for giving what he had coming, Clyde confessed. Well, no doubt you would. Well, Doc, I guess you get the trophy. It was you and your microscope that did the trick. All I had to do was to run down the one party out of 1,000,000 or so who had had cuticles scratched off the forearms, and then gather in the lost sheep and get them to blat their stories. You win. The young physician looked reprovingly. I just gave you a little technical assistance, Inspector. You caught the killer. Charlie Hin was moving about, his eyes open, his manacled hands groping toward his throat. He smiled evilly as the inspector looked down at him. The voice of the fool is never still, said he, but the dagger whispers a word, and the strong man bows himself in obeisance. What did you kill him for, Charlie? Forbes demanded. Was he blackmailing you too? He stole my sweetheart in China, Hin replied. He was a white devil, and she was a yellow rose. Now she is dead, and he is dead, and you may do as you please with me. I have been educated in the white man's schools and believe neither in his gods nor in my own. The words of the wise man and the words of fools are alike. For a little while they break the silence, and then both alike are still. Forbes nodded. And a good thing it is at that, he commented philosophically. It would be a bad day for the detective business if dead men began talking. All they'd have to do with a murder kick is bring the body of the deceased in and let him tell the jury his story. Jim Riddel returned late that night, a worried look on his face. He came into his wife's room, paused as he crossed the threshold, and seemed to be studying her expression. Everything all right, dear? He inquired anxiously. I got home as early as I could. I had to talk over a little matter with some fellows. The words stuck in his throat. He blushed till his face seemed about to catch fire. Helen was now looking steadily at him. Jim, she said softly, what did my friend Inspector Forbes do to you? Your friend, Inspector Forbes. But Jim was in no condition to talk. He mopped his forehead and sank into a chair. He stole a stealthy glance at the very pretty and obviously amused young woman who sat watching him. Tell me, dear, do you love me? He blurted. Of course. How can you ask? And there isn't anyone else. There never has been, Jim. You have always been my hero, my sun-crowned hero. Jim made a rush at her and gathered her into his arms. I'm a fool, he whispered. But no more of that jealousy stuff for me. It burns me up. Helen smiled up at him through misty eyes. End of The Chinese Tub by Edgar P. Meynell.